You're listening to the Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech insiders and experts. I'm Eric Schmidt, and my co-hosts today are Josh Schimmer, Brian Skorney, and Brad Loncar. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, please go to biotechhangout.com. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We're going to start with capital raising in biotech. In particular, we had one of the first early stage IPOs in quite some time. We've also continued to see some companies go public via maybe less traditional reverse merger route. And Brian, I know you flagged a colossal private potential offering in the space as well, which we'll catch. A bunch of industry news this week that, of course, will deserve our commentary, including some drama, I would say, and also some progress. We're going to talk about the FDA environment as well. This in advance of two very important adcom meetings next week, and maybe we'll close with the topic of whether the SEC is going to begin to change how companies are permitted or allowed to do their quarterly into semi-annual filings for Qs. So a lot to cover. Brian, I think it's just still you and I. Let's start with the IPOs and the capital raising. We did just last night, price for this morning, see Scribe go public. This is probably the first very early stage company to go public since the COVID era. I guess we can't quite call it a preclinical IPO because according to Scribe's prospectus, they are using their gene silencing technology in the clinic now. They just recently got approval in Australia, I believe, to begin to interrogate their lead candidate, which is a PCSK9 targeted therapy for hypercholesterolemia. But since that clearance of the Australian TGA just happened maybe less than 2 months ago, certainly this is an early stage IPO. Again, maybe not a preclinical IPO, but something that we haven't really seen much about from the last, 4 or 5 years now. It was a bit of a modest sized deal, priced at over $100 million, but it was upsized, and we'll see how well received it is. So I guess the first question that we'd like to take on is what this means for the broader biotech sector. Are we sliding away into an era where we're going to start to see early and early stage companies go public? And what do you make of that, Brian?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, and we sort of addressed this multiple times, right? There's just a cycle, and I've never seen the cycle not at peak absorb very early stage things. But I think I've also commented I haven't really seen the durability of the cycle allow for preclinical assets, preclinical companies to kind of hold valuation as you see a retreatment, right? So, it's sort of, there's always this dynamic of FOMO in the markets, and as money is available and you're looking for new ideas and people are, pushing valuations, you have to sometimes reach earlier and earlier to find companies, right? There's only a fixed amount of drugs that are in phase 3 development or phase 2 development or phase 1 development. And look, I mean, I don't think we haven't gone through an IPO cycle anywhere near some of the prior peaks. So like I don't necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily say this is like a bearish signal. But it's certainly a signal of an increasing risk tolerance in the market, that, once that risk tolerance goes away, and it will, a year or 2 years or 3 years, if things are out that are early stage and haven't gotten to proof of concept, they go through troubling times as the cycle unwinds. So, what inning are we are we in right now? Um, Tough to say. I certainly don't see all low quality or all super early companies coming out right now, but we've certainly seen a big move in the market, and we've certainly seen that window open up pretty meaningfully in the last year.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think maybe another thing to point out is that the valuation and the capital raised by Scribe this week was still a far cry from what we saw happening 5 years ago. In fact, back in 2021, the biggest ever IPO in the history of biotech at that time was a preclinical company. That was Sana Biotechnologies, which I think raised over $600 million, despite being at the time maybe about a year or so away from an IND, and it had a pre-money valuation of about $4.5 billion. So yeah, as we mentioned, Scribe was able to raise 120 million dollars or so on a much smaller valuation base. Clearly, we're not where we were 5 years ago in terms of the overexcitement and ebullience toward preclinical stage companies. But Brian, I agree with you. It's a little bit kind of be careful what you wish for, right? There's this fine line for these companies when they consider to go public between being able to access capital at a good valuation in the very near term, but potentially sacrificing their longer term future. Take a look at Sana today. That company is struggled. It's a fraction of the valuation and that it was when it went public. Yes, they benefited from being able to bring in a lot of capital, but today they're kind of at the whim of the public markets, and their valuation is still very much in the eye of the beholder. It's still an uphill slog for them, and that may be the case for Scribe and other earlier stage companies that aren't able to, kind of create enough of a following, enough of a fundamental clinical story when the markets do eventually turn.
Uh, I mean, maybe one other question, just kind of like thinking to stick on that theme of like when to go public, when not to go public, right? Like I think you look at like Sana's stock price, and it's clearly like hasn't been a good reward for public investors. But something you kind of brought up that piqued my interest is like from management standpoint, does that necessarily mean it's the wrong decision? And what would Sana be if they didn't raise capital in the public markets? Because could the private side have continued to fund them? They're alive as a company today, and I don't know if that would have been the case if they weren't able to take advantage of the market.
Well, not all companies even have the luxury of choosing if they IPO or not, because many companies are at the end of the line for raising funds from private investors for one reason or another, and if they want to continue, they IPO. Otherwise, they're out.
That's a fair point. I think it's not just up to the company management teams, but in many cases, it is the VCs that are pushing these companies to go public as soon as possible. We always hear that. We've heard that from other hosts, co-hosts of Biotech Hangout, that the world is set up to push companies out, and there is no break on the system. There is no ability to pull on the reins and stop that from happening. So yeah, Brian, to your comments earlier, I think we are seeing the evolution of a biotech IPO window. It's certainly opening greater and greater in terms of the aperture, and there's nothing anyone can do, including ourselves, other than stand by and watch. Speaking of that aperture, Josh, I know you flagged yet another reverse merger that happened this week, and the Wall Street Journal also commented on this sort of way of backing into the public markets with companies raising money through pipe transactions, the Mentari deal, or more generally, broadly, this phenomena that is also increasingly evident in the marketplace.
Yeah, it's kind of like reverse mergers finally figured out how to approximate an IPO with the benefits of the IPO, the capital raise of an IPO. Hindsight doesn't seem like rocket science. You do a reverse merger with a very sizable pipe with a strong group of institutional investors supporting you. The most recent one, Mentari reverse splurging into InMed, concomitant with nearly $300 million pipe. This is a company that's developing antibodies against PIGCAP and a bispecific PIGCAP CGRP antibody for migraine. Lundbeck recently validated this mechanism with its IV approach. Not clear if Lundbeck's going to be able to or interested in shifting that to a sub-Q option, but Mentari seems to be well positioned to do so. This is another Fairmont Paragon product profile. There's another company called Slate Therapeutics, very similar setup. Um, Obviously, we have quite a number of successful CGRP targeting programs in this space, so no reason to think you can't have a number of multiple successful PACAP targeting approaches. This is actually now the sixth reverse merger in biotech that's been accompanied by a $200 million plus financing. Last year was about three, the year before that, one, and prior to that, very little. So we're really seeing this new parallel process that companies are taking advantage of. And we track IPOs, we also track reverse mergers and historically have treated them separately, but this new reverse merger framework is very IPO-esque. So interesting innovation in this space.
So how do you guys feel about this growing trend of backing into public markets through the reverse mergers? Are there pros and cons that companies or investors should consider?
That's a good question. I'll get your take on it. Yeah, I think one of the challenges with the reverse merger approach is that sometimes it's hard to accompany that with good sell side research in the way that you might get with a traditional IPO. That may be one of the drawbacks. Perhaps offsetting that is that the fees to Wall Street may also be a little bit lower from what I understand. I don't think dramatically, but a little bit of a give take there. But others may have more informed perspectives on this particular point.
Well, it seems like many of these pipes that are being done are being done with Wall Street sponsorship, with investment banks as part of the transaction, and seemingly that there is at least some research coverage, some analysts following that is baked into the financing arrangements. So many of these companies are not being, completely orphaned by Wall Street out the gate. They seem to have some following, but they don't go through the traditional, multiple months or weeks long process, right? Where they're doing all of these test the water meetings and meeting, in many cases, tens of different mutual funds scattered all over the world. So that seems to be what's being left on the cutting room floor. That when you do go public, yeah, you go public with a handful maybe of backers who truly believe in you, but at least on the buy side, I get the sense that the story is quite narrowly told. Now, that's an opportunity for us as analysts. I love the fact that sometimes you can be first to a fresh piece of meat, or you can be first to a new story, and there's a obvious imbalance of information and opportunity. But from a company standpoint, yeah, sometimes it seems like it takes them 6 or 12 months to make up for the lack of pre-IPO activities and test the water meetings and IPO roadshow interactions. But Brian, I don't know if you have any views here.
I mean, I think I'd reiterate much of what you and Josh said. I think you're trading, efficiency and speed and reduced cost for a longer, more diligent, more exposed process, right? So it can happen fast. You can get it done. You can get and that's a benefit in many respects. But you definitely do it at the trade off of you are not as exposed to the public markets through this type of process.
Yeah, that's a great point. It does seem like these deals happen in lightning quick fashion in order to access public markets that are ripe for cap. So is the fact that we have seen more and more of these transactions over the last couple of months, is that a negative sign in your opinion?
Um, I don't feel that way. I mean, I think, valuations jumping up and quality going down and reaching earlier, whether it's through pipes, whether it's through reverse mergers, whether it's through IPOs, they're all sort of the similar signals. But you know, I I don't know if I like would necessarily recognize, I think even in like the biggest bear markets, I think we've seen a step up in reverse mergers because it's just been a little bit of an easier process. So I haven't run the data, but like, my knee jerk reaction would be that there's not a great correlation between, increasing reverse mergers and, a end of cycle issue.
Okay. So no sign that people are getting greedy while they can or have to, and that folks are expecting lesser times ahead. And who really knows anyway, right? I mean, we all know how unpredictable these markets can be. Well, why don't we continue with our thoughts on accessing capital? And Brian, you pointed out a very interesting media report on Colossal Biosciences. I don't know that a lot of our listeners are familiar with this one, so we'll need a little bit of background.
Oh, well, it's really easy. If you hear my background music, you totally can encompass this. So, Colossal is, essentially the de-extinction company. That's what they're billed as. Internally we joke that it's basically like Biosyn from Jurassic Park. And a lot of people would probably maybe saw the headline I think last year where there was an attempt to sort of resurrect dire wolves from genetic material and fossils. And that's basically this company's mo. They're looking to kind of recreate extinct species. Something that John Hammond did very well in Jurassic Park 35 years ago. But the interesting thing is Axios is reporting this year that they are looking for a new funding round at $20 to $30 billion valuation, which is a very, very large funding round. And I guess it goes back to the question of like, is this a end of cycle signal? And we could probably talk about this, but the question is like, would we even consider this biotech at all? And in sort of our precursor discussion to today, I said, well, it really is kind of like very, very classical biotech because it's all like biotechnology engineering. It's not biopharma, which is what like biotech has really evolved to be synonymous with. But it really is sort of a biotechnology effort that's ongoing, totally distinct from sort of providing therapeutic benefits, more akin to what we've seen in sci-fi fiction. But then the question becomes, the enthusiasm here, is it justified by the technology? Are they actually capable of doing what they propose to ultimately do? And we could debate that. My question is, even if they could do it, I wonder if, what is the actual revenue business opportunity here? And reading some of the papers about how they've sort of engineered the dire wolf, strikes me more that they're engineering some genetic material into gray wolves, more akin to like sort of a transgenic animal. And I was talking about this with my wife, who's a physician, last night, and she was like, well, the Jackson Labs doesn't carry a 20-30 billion dollar valuation. I just wonder, is there like a modable technology here that like any major transgenic animal laboratory wouldn't have some ability to do if this truly turned out to be a very profitable venture. So I guess with that, I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts on Colossal Biosciences and our
Yeah,
attempt to recreate the Velociraptor.
yeah, my understanding of the business model, and if others have a better sense, please chime in, is that there's like over 10,000 zoos in the world, and nearly a billion people who visit zoos. So if you sell a woolly mammoth to a zoo for $1 million or $2 million a pop, those numbers can get pretty big. I'm not sure what the other revenue streams are in terms of maybe informing biology and leading to new potentially therapeutic interventions or breakthroughs or whatever. But my understanding is, at least in the first iteration, selling animals to zoos. I have no idea what the cost of goods of those animals are going to be, or how R&D intensive or scale up it is. But it'll be interesting to see if someday we're all going to the zoo and checking out the woolly mammoth exhibit, and then heading over to the dodo bird exhibit, and then the dire wolf, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is fascinating.
We got you, Brad. Anything to add on our colossal bioscience discussion and whether this business model makes sense or whether we should even be considering Colossal as a biotechnology company?
To be honest, I didn't fully hear it, but here's what I think about Colossal that I think is a takeaway for all of us. So, when they've raised money, I've heard a lot of resentment from like drug developers and looking down on it. But what Colossal has that many of us don't is a great story. And it actually resonates outside of our industry very well. And it clearly resonated with investors. And so I would say, if you're in the camp of people who's like struggling to raise money for your own company right now, and you're thinking, gosh, like I'm trying to cure cancer, and what is this like vanity project going on that's like, raising all this money and getting all this attention? I would say, like, rather than being jealous, like, try to package what you're doing into a story that resonates more with investors and maybe even beyond that.
Well, that's a fair point. Narrative sell, and hopefully, they can turn that narrative into a viable business too. I mean, there were great narratives in the history of biotech. The human genome sequencing milestone was a great narrative that took a lot of companies to similarly sky high valuations, and some were able to turn that capital into real programs and persist today, and others never figured it out. So much like our discussion on some of the earlier stage preclinical companies, Scribe and Sana, when you have access to capital, you got to take advantage of it. But what about this point of defining a biotech company? If Colossal goes public, are guys like us going to cover it? Are we going to feel comfortable covering it? Do we want to cover it? Is it going to be in the biotech index? Should biotech investors view it as part of this industry? Josh, I know you had some views on this.
Yeah, can we plug our Control Arm podcast? It's a very, very, very different type podcast that literally gets into these types of questions and debates. It's not super relevant for the day-to-day biotech sector, but it is important as you think about how's the XBI constructed. Why are some life science tools companies in the XBI, whereas others are in the life sciences index? Why are some pharma companies in the XBI and some biotech companies in the pharma index? And it all kind of starts to matter and gets to the point of the way that we've been defining biotech has evolved over the years in a very unusual way. In a way that's kind of semantic creep, right? Like we used to carve out spec farm as its own separate worlds. But perhaps after the saga with Valiant, nobody wanted to be a spec farm company. It used to be a great thing to be a spec farm company. It mean discipline and profitability and cash flow and probably lower risk type drug development and innovation. But it just became this four-letter word. And we didn't have anything to do with these companies. We didn't have another nomenclature that evolved in lieu of spec pharma. So we just called them biotech, and perhaps with some rationale, right? Like we're all analysts who follow drugs through the NDA or the BLA process. Some companies do both. How do you draw a line and say, oh, this company is absolutely biotech, but that one is absolutely not biotech, and what do you call it, especially when no one wants to be that old thing? And so I think it's been a very effective semantic creep of the nomenclature. But to be honest, when I've been doing this for 2 decades, I dread the question that anyone might ask me, which is, what do you, what's biotech? What is the sector that you cover? Because it's a very uh, uh, difficult question to answer.
Well, I dread the question of will you cover Colossal Biosciences, because I know that I am woefully and inadequately prepared to look at a business model that's anything other than the therapeutic business model. Your point about industry creep is an interesting one. Back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there were a lot of tools companies, lab instrumentation companies that were going public around the genomic bubble and being covered by biopharmaceutical or biotech analysts at the time. And I was just unfortunate enough to be gifted a few of those, and it's a completely different business model. And that's just tools and lab supplies, which at least scientifically are somewhat related to the drug discovery effort. So going outside of drug discovery into zoos or I don't know, other popular media opportunities with the technology of this sort. I don't think that's where we ought to be. I'd go back to the foundation of our industry, Genentech. It was started by a venture capitalist and by a scientist, and those two folks got together for the first time and decided that the science was so cool that it was deserving of venture money, and that venture money was oriented at putting drugs into the marketplace that couldn't get there through other means. So, to me at least, biotech always was this perfect mix of venture backing with a therapeutic focus, and you need both. You need the science, you need the novelty, the innovation. I didn't like it either when Spec Pharma kind of crept into our industry, and we were talking about moving a twice a day drug into a once a day formulation. But I think you also need the venture backing, and those two requirements have created everything that we love and hold near and dear. But Brian or Brad, do you guys want to have the last word on this topic?
I'm good. Well said.
Okay, let's move on then. And Brad, you hosted a big Biotech TV Science Summit this week. So tell us about that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's the first event that Biotech TV has ever had, and we had it in Kendall Square at Mass Bio. And I want to thank Mass Bio for not only giving us the space to do this, but being like a top sponsor, and also Bio, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. And I should thank Daphne for that because she put me in touch with them. And the idea was to put on an event that like supports the whole biotech sector. Something that we talk about here a lot is just it feels like our country is starting to pull back from science at a time when others like China and other places are doubling down. And so we just wanted to like bring together a summit, and we had a few themes, but like a major theme was like, how do we better explain the work that we're doing to the general public? Because we need the support of just ordinary people, like the American people, so to speak, if we want to keep, NIH funding growing, and if we want to keep, more people going into science as a career and all of that. So we had like a half day event, and we had some really great speakers. So like speaking of the NIH, we had Elias Zerhouni, the former NIH director. We had Nubar Afayan. We had a lot of companies that are at the forefront of great technologies. Nello Mainolfi from Chimera, Sam Kulkarni from CRISPR Therapeutics, Jason Kelly from Ginkgo, and they kind of talked about how they were able to do the work of these of this generation of new technologies, right here in Boston, and what we need to do to make sure that the next generation of future technologies that this area is competitive in them. And uh, I always try to have like a different angle to everything, and the thing that was I think really unique and innovative and fun and cool about this conference was in addition to like it being like a normal conference with like biotech crowd, we invited and literally flew out and put up in a hotel 20 of the most highly followed what we call psychomers. So these are like young people who are science advocates who are at the start of their career, who most of them recently earned a PhD, or they're working on it or something. And these are young people that have, in many cases, like 4 or 500,000 followers on social media, on Instagram or TikTok. And the ones that we invited are the ones who are doing it right. These are not like crazy people who are pushing something or like alternative medicine. These are people who work in a lab and have done research and just happen to be young and really good communicators. So they were there, and they, we learned from them, and they learned from us, because I feel like these two groups of people live on different planets, and they don't really have access to, or at least not until today, didn't really have exposure to the corporate biotech world, and so it's really cool to have them, and like for that group of people, we actually gave like our conference was like a Tuesday half day conference. We gave them a whole 3 days experience in Boston in Kendall Square. So like Scott Kersner gave them a walking tour of Kendall Square, and then really cool. Greg Verdine was a guest of honor at a dinner we had, and he talked about how he became a scientist and all of the things that he's worked on with Raz and beta catenin and everything. And we also took this group of 20 young communicators, and after our conference was over on Tuesday, we sent them out to biotech companies. And I am amazed at the companies that opened their doors and rolled out the red carpet to this. Like, I'm really proud of it. So, like, Moderna, for example, took all 20 of them, and they gave our group a talk and a lab tour, and then they gave them all chances to do one on one interviews with top Moderna scientists. And, it was exactly what I'd hoped it would be. It was like a young person, like, asking a Moderna scientist, like, hey, we hear in the news that like this vaccine, causes harm or didn't work or whatever. Like, what do you have to say from that? And they're right there at Moderna's headquarters. Like, Moderna had a chance to explain to a very broad audience through these science communicators what the truth is. And we had a breakfast at Alnylam where Yvonne Greenstreet gave a talk about RNAi, and we sent them out to like 6 or 7 others, medium and small size biotech companies too, where they saw robotics and everything. And also John Maraganore did a dinner with them as well, where he talked about how Alnylam almost went broke a bunch of times, and didn't become profitable until just like a year ago. And so they really heard the story of biotech. And I'm a big believer that and we see this through BiotechTV, like when you show our industry for what it really is, and when you show the people of our industry for who they really are, it really resonates with a wide audience. And so we wanted to start a conversation where we introduced ourselves to these younger people that can be a conduit to a much bigger audience than we're currently reaching. Because I feel like a lot of times we only talk to ourselves. If a biotech company has news, you put out a press release and you only care about that press release, like reaching investors or other people in the biotech sector. And if there was another take home message, I hope that it matters. We're doing great things that are exciting, and like the public should know about it, because at the end of the day, if the public doesn't support us, and ours is a very misunderstood industry today. If the public doesn't support us, that makes our lives more difficult, and that ultimately makes it more challenging to help patients. And so, this conference, the theme of it was, how do we start to turn that tide? And it was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot about putting on a conference and everything. And I'm really thankful to everybody. Who from far and wide traveled to be there that day. I think it was a lot of fun, and it was a really unique conference.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Brad, and thanks for hosting the conference. You're 100% correct that science education and awareness in this company, I mean, put us in this country, put aside just our biotech community, but more broadly in America, is woefully lacking. And anything we can do to improve scientific acumen is welcome. You look at what's going on at the FDA this week with the MAHA-oriented reviews of peptides, and the hope that maybe we'll have some time to talk about this or not. But I think, in summary, many of our listeners are aware that the FDA just voted 8-6 yesterday to allow compounding pharmacies to approve a peptide that really hasn't been shown to be either safe or efficacious. I don't quite understand where the MAHA fascination has come with peptides, but it's a completely unscientific pursuit. And you do think that, well, if we had people in the country that were able to better communicate what is science and what's not science, maybe we wouldn't have to be watchful of such episodes as we're seeing right now. But let's get to other topics, or unless anyone else wants to comment on that. I'm not sure we're actually going to have much time for the peptide discussion anyway. So, any takers?
Well, I'll just really quick, Eric, respond and say thank you for what you said. And like another thing that I'd say about it is that I think a challenge that we have is like the conspiracy theories and like the junk science and everything. One reason it's so prevalent is because um, that's like highly organized. Like the people who believe in that stuff are like a tight knit, like very organized community. And so that messaging spreads very quickly. And one thing I would say to like keep our head up is I think people who believe and trust in science is actually a much bigger community. And like we do have all of those voices, but it's all very fragmented. And so so a goal of this conference was to start to solidify that fragmentation, to so that we can start speaking more as a group, because our interests are aligned, but we just are living in different worlds.
Oh, great point. And again, thank you for all your efforts and the efforts at the conference this week to try and do just that, bring folks together who can really matter and work in a more concerted fashion. Let's move on to the next topic. Josh, I think maybe you're going to introduce the Immix biopharma debacle that we unfortunately had to deal with this week. Maybe we've lost Josh. Brian, you want to take it?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean,
By the way, I can take this, Brian, if you'd like to. I know all about it, and I feel strongly about it.
I mean, I was
Not
going to
to
split it with
not to
Josh
interject.
anyway, so I'm prepped too. But if you want to
Okay.
start off, and then we can talk more in depth about it. But go ahead, Brad.
Yes. So the background on this is there was a guy who 20 years ago seemed to have been a legitimate doctor. I think he was a radiologist or an anesthesiologist, and he lived in Rhode Island, and he assaulted a woman, and he was arrested and went to court, and in the middle of the court case he fled. Um, and he literally wrote his lawyer a note that said, I think I'm innocent, but I can't stand the possibility of being found guilty. So I'm going to flee the country and you're never going to hear from me again. It was nice to meet you. Thanks for representing me. And in, in absentia, he was convicted of this terrible crime. And so he literally just, quote unquote, he literally disappeared for a couple of decades. And somehow the Rhode Island FBI and U.S. Marshals got a tip 20 years later, like a week ago, learning that this guy might be in the United States, and he was actually on a sailboat, like off the coast of New Jersey, and they tracked him down and they arrested him. And it turned out that he was, I don't know about the full 20 years, but at least for like the last handful of years, he was living under an alias. And he recently, in March, was hired as the chief medical officer for Immix Biopharma, like a publicly traded biotech company, and also had worked at another biotech company previously. So if you haven't seen the news, Adam wrote an amazing story and everything. And I'll just very quickly jump in with an opinion that I thought was beyond ludicrous. So Immix, all they did from this story is they put out an 8K saying that this guy was fired and that they didn't believe it was a material event for their company, and that's it. And I thought that that was about as ludicrous as a way you could handle this from like a PR and communications and all that standpoint, because this guy was literally their chief physician. And I know it was only for 3 months, but what does it say about you as a company that you literally hired a con art? Because there was obviously, to get hired for the company, he appears to have had a whole fake backstory. He said he worked at Merck and Sanofi and all this stuff, and he said he was an oncologist. And I don't want to get in trouble by saying the wrong thing, but it seems like all of that was just flat out false. And so it seems that this company had as their chief physician a con man. And if I'm a physician working for that, that's gonna have their therapy in my trial, if I'm a patient that's receiving one of their therapies, I think it's a pretty material thing that your chief physician was literally a con man. And so it's a fascinating story. I hope Adam literally writes a book about this one day just to learn all of the crazy facts. But I think it also does say something about crisis management and how to handle situations like this. And in my opinion, I thought Immix handled it about as poorly as you could handle it. It basically made Immix look like an amateur hour company, and they were okay with that.
Brian, what do you have?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. Brad really covered it well. I think it sharply contrasts with what we were talking about earlier of how we really are doing great things in biotech and biopharma, and it winds up being very misunderstood. And sometimes because there are these cases of like kind of craziness that occur in the sector. And I mean, this reminded me like the Serhat Gamruko case of the Notion Biosciences co-founder who like hired a guy to kill another guy. Maybe it was this like 6 or 7 years ago, right? So these periodically pop up, and it's very bad press for biotech, even though I'd argue a lot of these companies, aren't really companies that are necessarily followed by any of us or given a ton of credence. But when it happens, it really kind of like sticks out as a case. But yeah, to your point, I mean, how did this guy get hired at Atosa back in 2022? Like, where was the first hire that this guy was able to like reemerge into a a senior leadership role as a physician with like an entirely created background, right? Like it's just so strange to me how someone who spent all this time becoming a physician, getting convicted of crime, disappearing from the U.S. and then reemerging in the U.S. Under a totally different name is able to kind of create that narrative that no one really checks on. And I totally agree on the Immix 8K. Look, and this is probably an extreme case that's not normal, but bad things happen in this sector, right? Like drugs fail, safety issues occur, and I always try to encourage people, you got to like get ahead of that. Like, don't try to hide when things like this happen. Even if you're going to take a blow, it's going to be a worse blow to try to hide behind an 8K and not make any commentary about the materiality or what happened than it will be to say, hey, look, this is what happened. It's crazy. Like, give kind of the true story of what happened to the public.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you said, Brian, kind of resonated with me. We, sitting from the outside as investors, sometimes look at these companies and the executives of these companies and almost have this perception that these are legitimate, high-level operating organizations, and yet we have seen this time and time again. I think about Immix. This was a $2 stock a year ago, and it was maybe a sub $200 million company at the time. I don't know, maybe they had 30 or 40 employees. I mean, it shouldn't be the default that we look at organizations of this sort that are kind of on the fringe in biotech, and we say, "Wow, they must have gotten their ducks in a row. They must have checked all the boxes. They must have done their background checks. They must have done this, that, or the other." In my at least perception and experience dealing with many of these smaller and less well-resourced companies is that they are cutting a lot of corners in order to just persist, just survive, just try and make payroll, just try and get to the next milestone. So, that's something we need to accept as analysts and investors when we're fishing in these shallower pools of water. But to point the finger at ourselves too, our own industry, the investment industry, has certainly had the wool pulled over our eyes with similar con men type experiences. You guys will all remember, of course, Matt Martoma, the .72 SAC analyst who went to jail for basically paying off Alzheimer's physician for information around their phase 3 trial. Matt's whole backstory was much like this guy's. He feigned that he had graduated from these illustrious institutions and had an A+ resume, and when he was finally caught red-handed for bribing an official, or at least bribing a KOL, all that stuff came out. So yeah, be careful and be somewhat skeptical about what you were told by people.
You said you
Let's
weren't going to be
see.
the
So
skeptic today, Eric.
couldn't help but talk about that story. I'm sure you lived it just as vividly as I did, Brian.
I do remember those days.
Yeah. So let's move on to better news. And I think, Brian, you wanted to chat about the Dyne BLA acceptance for their DMD drug, Z-rostudirsen is what they're calling it these days.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think thematically we're going to now move into a bunch of regulatory stuff, and nothing really embodies the regulatory debate as much as drugs for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which has been a source of a lot of controversy for half my career now. So Dyne Therapeutics submitted their BLA for a drug that is basically, and this goes back to sort of the original controversy with Sarepta and Exondys 51 or eteplirsen, which is a PMO that is in a subset of DMD patients called exon 51 amenable. It's able to sort of skip the broken part of the gene and create almost full length dystrophin. Eteplirsen does this in a very, very small amount. It was approved on the basis of being able to show increases in dystrophin expression. A number, three other drugs were subsequently approved that do similar things on different exons. That was a very controversial decision in the FDA at the time. There was an internal debate that went all the way up to the commissioner's level. What Dyne is doing is they have basically a very similar model, but what they're using is they're using an antibody to make the PMO go directly to the muscle. And what you're seeing is higher expression of dystrophin than what you see with just sort of a naked PMO like Sarepta. It also winds up with a more favorable dosing interval. So like Exondys 51 is dosed weekly. This is dosed monthly. So, is a little bit better in terms of dosing convenience for patients. Certainly better dystrophin expression. And the question is, will the FDA approve something that's better than eteplirsen, despite the controversies around eteplirsen? I think that's, what's notable is in the background here, and this company has a PDUFA date in late January. What's notable in the background here is Sarepta has also filed an NDA to look for full approval of their drugs, Vyondys 53 and Amondys 45, which were the subject of a large 2-year phase 3 study in DMD patients that ultimately failed to achieve its primary endpoint. There's a big question is, does this validate, as I think Sarepta would make an argument for, that despite missing the primary endpoint, there's enough there to validate that this drug is doing something, or does it, kind of recreate the original controversy that even though this is making a small amount of dystrophin, that dystrophin may not be doing anything clinically at all. So it'd be very interesting to have, effectively the same, Division of Neurology 1 reviewing both of these applications simultaneously, having a phase 3 data set showing that, let's call it like a little less than 1% of normal dystrophin is not clearly providing a robust clinical benefit over a 2-year, 200 plus patient study. But does this version of it, which makes a materially larger amount of dystrophin and is a much more convenient dosing interval for patients, does it meet the metric for substantial evidence of effectiveness? It's really hard to think that the FDA could give Amondys and Vyondys full approval based on the Essence phase 3 data set and not very, very clearly approve Dyne Z-Ros for DMD, given that on pretty much every metric, it's better than eteplirsen. So, expect people to follow this very, very closely. And it'll be, again, another good indication of like where we lie at right now in terms of FDA flexibility. And I know we've obviously had a lot of changeover at the FDA in the recent months that we talk about a lot here. But, this is definitely one to watch. I think it's going to get approved. I think it's very hard to try to make a case to pull any of the PMOs from the market. The community and advocacy groups are very powerful. They really believe that these drugs do work. And in that background, it's hard to say that this isn't at least a better mousetrap than what's available.
Oh, I agree 100% with you. This is definitively, I would say, a better mousetrap than Exondys in terms of everything, right? In terms of dystrophin expression, in terms of some of the functional data that they have put forth, which at least is intriguing, and as you mentioned, also the convenience factor. So, given the very, very, very low benchmark that was set by the FDA and by Sarepta years ago, it's pretty hard to see how this doesn't get approved. I don't even understand honestly what the debate in investor circles is, as you point out, Brian. Like, what's the counter to this should be approved? That we should withdraw every DMD from the market, every DMD drug from the marketplace? No, that's obviously not going to happen. The other thing I just wanted to say is congrats to the Dyne team. I mean, this team had been kind of beaten up over the last couple of years in investment circles, given some of the turnover they've had at the company and some of the delays in executing around their other program. But in this case, they killed it, right? At the avidity and their Delzota was going to be the first muscle-targeted oligo to come to the market for DMD, and the Dyne guys were able to file about a month or so ahead of Novartis, and now they have this priority review PDUFA date. So this should, in many ways, become the first of its kind in terms of a new drug class, and the execution's been nothing but crisp around this program. Brad, anything you want to add, or should we move to next week's activities at the FDA?
Let's move on.
All right. So two, I would argue, very important AdCom panels shaping up for next week. We've got Replimune and their RP1 drug for refractory melanoma patients, which is going to be reviewed, I think, on Thursday, the 30th, is it? And then next week also, we have Capricor's Deramiocel, this cell therapy-oriented product, also for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Both of these drugs have been in the news a lot. I know we've covered both of these drugs on the Hangout in the past, so probably no need to go through the past history and the controversy around these approvals. Both have been, I'd say, following a very torturous route through the agency and to these upcoming panels. And maybe to me, the most interesting about the thing about next week is whether the outcome of these two panels is going to change our broader perception to the FDA. I guess, are we going to be looking at the thumbs up or thumbs down votes on these two drugs and saying, okay, that's very specific to these factors, these idiosyncratic variables around these programs, and it may be a good thing or a bad thing that neither of these drugs or both of these drugs or one of these drugs gets through, but it has no broader read through to the FDA? Or are we going to be looking at this as a litmus test? Really, the first very, very public decision making under the new commissioner, Kyle Diamantis, and saying, wow, we've got a whole new tone one way or another at the FDA that we didn't appreciate before. So would love to hear your views on this. Brad, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say that I strongly believe that we need more adcoms, not less. And I think that's been a bad trend lately over multiple administrations. I don't think it's just something that's going on today, although it has been much sparser today because it literally represents what our country is. Like the FDA and government agencies like it are supposed to serve the people. And the biggest mistake that Vinay made, or having Vinay in the position that he was at the FDA, was he was a my way or the highway type of person. He had very strong opinions and he wanted to change the way the drugs individual reviews were done based off of his own opinions. And if I'm being honest, I think um, sometimes Rick Pasder has had the same approach to things. And in our country, those government agencies are supposed to represent the will of the people. And, we have that very broad term, safe and effective, and that means different things to different people. And the best way to show that like anything got a fair shot is to have a public hearing about it and allow the experts of whatever that is. So in this case, melanoma oncology community to talk about it from a professional medical way. And also, if anyone from the community has, like, literally any person, I've gone to a meeting like that, and as just a citizen, I've, said something and asked a question, and you can do that. And so I think it's a good thing that those are happening. And regardless of the outcome, at least now you can say that more things were aired out in public and it will be less controversial. So that's my 2 cents.
I think that's very lucid analysis, and agree with you both about Dr. Pastor as well as Dr. Prasad. It's nice to get this stuff aired out in public. But if I press you, Brad, if both of these drugs get approved, or let's say both of these drugs are fortunate enough to be rejected, are you going to translate that outcome to the broader FDA? Or are you willing to say, you know what, these are just two idiosyncratic events?
Uh, it's hard to forecast. I mean, it would. I I think it would only be newsworthy if we have one of these rare situations where an adcom totally goes against it and, FDA approves it, or vice versa. Like it, you know, gets a unanimous yes vote and then FDA ultimately rejects it, which, has happened under like more normal circumstances in the past. So we'll have to see.
Fair point. Brian, what are your thoughts on the FDA?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would reiterate Brad's point. I mean, I love adcoms. I mean, probably not the most efficient use of time, but one of my favorite things to do is going down to the FDA campus and seeing these adcoms live. Now have done many more just watching them virtually, even when they are actual events that are held down on the campus. But I totally agree. I mean, this is the opportunity to be transparent in your views, your thesis, to kind of air everything out in public over a full day event. And I think this is the way to properly handle sort of scientific debate. And look, I think Vinay and I think Macri, like their arguments were like, well, you can just you could do whatever you want with the panel. You could stack the panel. You could like put briefing documents out to say whatever you want. So like, are they just kind of like a waste of time and resources? And I would still argue, even if you're going to stack the panel, or even if the FDA is going to just really, really be very aggressive in their specific view around what should happen, it's still airing that out, right? And you see cases like aducanumab, where the FDA like very clearly put out their view, which was you should approve this, and the panel was not having any of it, and it was like a full-on rejection of the data, right? And then the FDA wound up approving it, and it's still like a very controversial decision, although less controversial on subsequent amyloid plaque removers, so showing effects. But I still think like this is sort of the best way to go about the scientific review process, to do it publicly. So I'm very excited for it. Does it wind up showing? Is this a more flexible tone of the FDA? Look, if they're both yeses, like if both of these briefing documents are benign briefing documents, and the FDA reviewers are like, yeah, we kind of think it should be approved, and like we're looking for panel guidance on who, or under what format it should get approved. I think that's extremely positive for FDA flexibility. I definitely think it's more than a one-off event. And if both of these applications, and look, we've seen complete response letters on some applications, so we have a little bit of some of the point of at least some people on the FDA. But I mean, if these briefing documents are just unearthing negative thing after negative thing, and basically saying, hey, like you have to reject this because like these are the problems, then that's a new tone too, or that not necessarily a new tone, but it gives us insight into that tone. And I think that's what we don't really know. Like, what is the tone for the FDA under Kyle? It's hard to imagine that it's more stringent than FDA under Vinay. As an example, but we don't know exactly where this FDA currently sits either.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys both make great points. I will be looking at some sense of direction from the FDA from these votes and these briefing documents. But the point you make on transparency is critical for these two products in particular. So much of the past history for both Dermicell as well as RP1 has been kept out of the public eye. We really don't know, through the torturous path that these drugs have followed, what happened and why. So it'd be really great to air that out publicly. But that is it for us. We are out of time. It's top of the hour. Let me just conclude by thanking Brad and Brian and Josh, who I know had to hop off, for a wonderful episode of Biotech Hangout.